were frameworks and structured into frameworks. And an apprenticeship framework was a list of qualifications that had to be achieved to then achieve the actual overall apprenticeship. So, for example, apprenticeship standard would have consisted of a BTEC national, um, an NVQ qualification, and depending on what level that would be a BTEC national or a NVQ2 or NVQ3. And to achieve the apprenticeship framework, you had to pass all those qualifications. And about 2014-ish, the Institute for Apprenticeships was established. And the main reason was to rationalize apprenticeships and make it much more employer-led. And from out of that came the concept of apprenticeship standards, which is what is now being delivered primarily across the country in England and Wales. And it can be quite confusing to understand what an apprenticeship standard is if you're not close to the action like we are as providers. But an apprenticeship standard contains knowledge, skills, and behaviours that are required by an apprentice to successfully undertake a discipline-specific role. So these standards and competencies are actually written by employers and trailblazer groups, which I'll come on to in a second. And what they're trying to move away from is the idea that an apprenticeship standard, an apprenticeship is purely a list of qualifications. What it actually is now is achieving competence for a vocational standard. And that includes knowledge, skills, and behavior competencies. And each standard will have its own KSBs, as we call it. And it's the KSBs that define the apprenticeship standard. And they are occupation focused. They are not specifically qualification led, which is another key change to apprenticeships. An apprenticeship standard does not necessarily need to contain a qualification, which, that's debatable, and lots of providers and employers have their own views on that. And as we move through this discussion, we can discuss it and talk about that. Now, the assessment with an apprenticeship framework, the old apprenticeship approach, was continuous assessment throughout the whole of the apprenticeship. Whereas now, the assessment with an apprenticeship standard is in the form of an externally assessed endpoint assessment, which occurs right at the end of the apprenticeship. So the apprenticeship effectively is developing competence leading up towards the endpoint assessment and the achievement of the endpoint assessment. And that is right at the end of the apprenticeship. And we can discuss that a little bit more in a minute. Which is a key change, of course. So it isn't the providers assessing the apprenticeship. It is, in fact, an externally into the apprenticeships. And it's focusing in on the competencies and the achievement of the competencies and the development of those competencies. And again, I mentioned briefly before about the Institute of Apprenticeships. This is a body which has been set up by the government to coordinate and approve all apprenticeship standards and T-level qualifications, the new T-levels that have been developed. And they are really, in my opinion, having worked with them and developed trailblazer apprenticeships in the past, they are a good organisation to work with. It takes a while, but they're very competent. So, what are higher and degree apprenticeships? As I mentioned earlier, they are part of the apprenticeship trailblazer funding model. So, each apprenticeship standard has to be designed and developed by employers. It's not by universities, colleges, it is by the employer. So trailblazer groups need to be set up and organized to actually design and develop an apprenticeship standard. And that takes time. Quite a lot of time, actually, in some cases. It can take up to 2 years. And when I come up later on some of the challenges that we face with developing and running these programs, you'll see that the length of time means that some employers are reticent about actually getting involved because it does take a long time. But it does mean that when an apprenticeship standard is approved, it is recognised and it is known that they have been developed by at least 12 apprenticeship standards. So what are they? Well, they are specialist advanced on the job vocational training and development programs. They enable potentially the study of an academic qualification up to honours level, usually level 4, 5 and 6, but certainly at honours level for what we call an integrated degree apprenticeship, and hopefully I'll come on to that later. Some higher apprenticeships can include academic qualifications, but this is generally the exception rather than the rule. Now, that causes some consternation because many students who are leaving sixth form and they're coming out with decent A levels or they're coming out with other decent level 3 qualifications, they do want to do an apprenticeship and they do potentially want to undertake a higher apprenticeship with an employer. But they also recognise the fact that they want to potentially have progression into the future. And therefore, a lot of people at that age, particularly with good A levels, are looking at the opportunity to study for a higher education qualification at the same time. And with some higher apprenticeships now having academic qualifications within them, it does mean potentially that these learners may come out of an apprenticeship without a degree level qualification, which to me, it does stifle potential progression opportunities. So there is a level of reticence in there. But as developers and designers of curriculum, we can embed our own qualifications within the apprenticeship standards so we can get a best of both worlds approach with this. They also accelerate the intellectual and practical skills ability and problem solving skills of graduates. I think many of us know that we could well have first class honours graduates coming into employment, and then we've got to spend 2 years actually training them to do the job. And that's not just the skills element of the job, that's also the behavioural elements. So what these apprenticeships do, if we do have degree qualifications within them, is they not only develop their academic skills and knowledge, but they develop their behavioural elements and their work readiness. We'll come on to that again in a second. The occupational competencies required for recognition by an appropriate professional body. That's really important. What we've done in our programs is we've not only mapped them to competencies within apprenticeship standards, wherever possible, we've also mapped them to the UK spec AEP4, which means that when they're coming out of an apprenticeship, say for example at level 6 with an honours degree, they are fit and ready, we think, to potentially apply for ING. And in fact, some degree apprenticeships, like the civil engineering apprenticeship, for example, the Institute of Civil Engineers is actually the endpoint assessment organisation. So when they're carrying out the endpoint assessment, they are also carrying out the professional review interview for ING, which is a real attraction, of course. So, why do we need higher and degree apprenticeships? Well, the government has published a number of skills strategy papers which have identified a shortage of students entering technical education at levels 4 and 5. And this has become a bit of a problem because that's where the technician grade sits. Most students, as we probably know, when they're leaving sixth form, prefer to enter long, fat honours degree programs on a full-time basis, which means they're coming out of a level 6 qualification, which is leaving behind the technician level effectively. Because in the early 90s, I can vaguely remember that far back. UCLan University, well, not University of Northumbria at the time, Preston Polytechnic, Newcastle Polytechnic, who were focused on delivering technical level 4 and 5. And when they changed to universities, I'm not just trying to focus on Preston and Newcastle, but across the country, the polytechnics effectively left behind level 4 and 5, and the focus became on level 6 provision. And that's what that's created is a skills gap effectively at technician level, and it's been recognised that this is continuing to widen. So there are a number of initiatives that the government are bringing in, and part of this is higher and degree apprenticeships to fill that gap. Also, education and potentially miss the employed demand qualifications at levels 4 and 5. This has all been recognised, so there's a variety of different strategies to meet this and address it. And I think full-time degree programs have not necessarily developed the real work experience, and generally require, as I said earlier, further behavioural and skill development before entry to employment. So again, these higher and degree apprenticeships are addressing that. And as I move forward through this discussion, I can describe how we've tried to do that and the learning that's taken place. So within the apprenticeships is developing that work readiness elements. Challenges and rules, yeah, there's quite a few of these, as you can imagine. As with any government program, there are challenges and there are lots of rules to comply with. The complexity of funding rules, for one thing, can put off some employers. For example, the apprenticeship levy and the cap. I'll just pause there for a second. How many of you have actually heard of the apprenticeship levy and the cap? I'm very quiet on me. I can't see the comments box. That's the problem when I'm presenting here. But if you want to come off mute and let me know.
Yes, familiar with it.
Okay, yeah, we've heard of it, Paul.
Okay, good. So, yeah, and generally the apprenticeship levy is set by and actually defined by the trailblazer group, the employer group that's setting up the apprenticeship at the beginning, and it's a cap which says this is the expected amount of or the expected cost to a provider of delivering that apprenticeship standard. And the apprenticeship levy and the cap will vary per standard depending on the nature of it. But the funding rules around it are becoming even more complex in many ways. And I think some of the things I've listed here will relate to that. For example, off the job training time. One of the rules now is that an employer has to contractually comply with a minimum of 6 hours per week of off the job training time. Now that can be in a college, it could be in a university, it could be on training programs within the organization. That's auditable, and that has to be logged. So with some employers, okay, some of the smaller employers, they may not necessarily have the infrastructure or the logistics to cope with that sort of basically processing the data from that. So that's a challenge and can be a challenge. It's also a challenge to providers, because the providers are also audited against that. So we have to ensure that the providers are giving that off-the-job training time. Now this is big, the next one, and this is actually the assessment of the apprenticeship starting points, and this links back to funding again. Now, I can share a recent experience that we've had. We had a pilot inspection back in February this year from Ofsted, and Ofsted do inspect apprenticeships at all levels, including levels 4, 5, and 6. And part of the feedback that I received from the inspector, and it was actually more of a question than anything else, and that was, are the employers only using the apprenticeship, like putting people on higher and degree level apprenticeships purely to use the levy to pay for the degree qualifications, or the other higher qualifications are included within the standard? And to be fair, that was a really good question, because the actual answer to that, if I was to put hand on heart, the answer to that is probably yes, they are. And that is against apprenticeship rules and funding rules, because effectively they should only be doing an apprenticeship if the apprenticeship meets the requirements of the learner and basically demonstrates that they are developing all competencies from a relatively low starting base. Otherwise, the funding changes. So if they're not starting at a relatively low foundation base, there could be a reduction in levy and cap. So that is an issue these days. So what we have to do is we have to assess where apprentices are against the competencies right at the beginning and even before the apprenticeship starts. So we have to clearly identify that they are appropriate for an apprenticeship program. Now, it might be that somebody's been in employment or with a particular employer for 20 years even, and they've developed all the skills and behavioral competencies in the world. But that then means that the apprenticeship is not suitable for that person. Only the achievement of the knowledge competencies, which generally means that it will be the degree or higher education qualification only and not the apprenticeship. And that would then mean the employer has to pay for the higher education fee. So there's all sorts of challenges around the funding rules and the starting points. Sorry for labouring that point a bit, but it's become really important.
Can I just ask a question there, Paul?
Yeah.
Isn't it though, coming back to the level of the competence you're actually assessing against is what you're demonstrating their starting point is against? Absolutely.
And that's absolutely true. And basically we're cutting a starting point assessment. So, and it is important to understand that how we're assessing each of those competencies initially against the actual level of the apprenticeship standard itself. I think that's the question, isn't it, in reality? So yes, absolutely. It does come back to the level of the qualification, or the level of the apprenticeship standard, should I say, and then the starting point would be relative to that. And that also adds elements of complexity to it. But if you've got somebody coming in with an existing H&D qualification wanting to come onto a level 6 standard, then yes, they have made some progress towards achieving of the behavioural and skills development, and the funding model will reflect that. It's something that we're working on at the moment, and I think all providers are busy coming up with models to support that with employers. Engagement of employers with the learning experience. This has been varied, actually. We work with some very large employers and we work with some SMEs. And it's really important that the employers understand their commitment to the apprenticeship standard and what their role is within that. And that needs to be identified right at the beginning. So any information and guidance at the beginning is not just for the learner, it's also for the employer. So that's really important. Another constraint in reality is the limited availability of higher degree technical apprenticeship standards. There isn't that many, to be fair, particularly in STEM areas. And that is primarily because of the time taken to actually develop an apprenticeship standard and the commitment from the employers to develop it. Because it's not just a commitment of being on the Trailblazer group to write the standard and take it to a successful conclusion. They also have to commit for a further 2-3 years beyond that for any development elements to it as well. So part of it is excellent. There has to be good employer engagement, but obviously there is an impact on employers in terms of the time required to develop it. And that links to the next point, the Trailblazer rules. The other thing is, if qualifications are included in apprenticeship standards. Now, what I'm saying here is, let's say the apprenticeship standard that's been produced doesn't state a qualification, and quite a lot do, as I mentioned earlier. If a provider wants to include a qualification, and that's probably then in agreement with the employer, how are they integrated? And that leads me on to the rest of this discussion. How are they integrated? Because we could be asked that question again by Ofsted. Why are they doing the qualification? Why are they not just doing the apprenticeship standard? So it's a very, very important question that has to be answered. So how do we integrate the qualification into it if we're going to run with a qualification which is not named in the apprenticeship standard? So I thought I'd share our learning from this and how we've gone about it. Basically a synergy of vocational and academic in our words. It's not a standalone qualification. Sorry, my phone's just gone on there. It's not a standalone qualification. It can't be. It has to support the development of the competencies within the apprenticeship standard. So how do we go about this? Well, as part of the National College for Nuclear provider network, we have a standard curriculum development approach. And it's a top-down approach. So the curriculum qualification advising group, which is a national committee for nuclear, sits and identifies high-level needs within the nuclear industry. And I'm only using the nuclear industry here as an example. And they sit as usually between 12 and 16 employers within the nuclear industry, and they sit and actually identify where they think the major skill gaps are within the nuclear industry. And these are very high level identifications and gaps and so forth. And generally it needs to be rationalized. So the National College for Nuclear supports that group. We don't sit on the committee, but generally we generally have a representative who's invited onto the committee at particular points to advise on what. By sitting and advising, we're then given higher level objectives in terms of what is required, and we then have an action committee that defines which provider will respond to that need, and also that action committee with the National College for Nuclear also responds to local demand identified by approved delivery partners. So what we're actually doing there is identifying, right, which provider is best suited to design a curriculum to meet the need. And at that point, we then set up either a course development group or an apprenticeship standards development group. And then that group of providers or provider, potentially one provider, will then go about with the employers identifying the curriculum need. If it's an apprenticeship standard, we're there to support the Trailblazer group as part at that stage. So it's a top-down approach, and effectively we could have a number of curriculum design projects going on the go at any one point in time. But the key thing is we're taking the lead from CQAG. So locally, collaboration is absolutely essential to make this happen. If we are going to bring together the academic and the vocational, we have to have a collaborative approach. Local, I'm just with reference to Lakes College as far as the LFE is concerned. We deal closely with the University of Cumbria, who's also a partner of the National College for Nuclear. And the University of Cumbria acts as our validation agent for degree level 5 and level 4 qualifications. Lakes College with the National College for Nuclear is identifying the curriculum area and the technical elements supported by the employer. And we design the curriculum to meet the need, be it a curriculum to map to a apprenticeship standard, or even with a Trailblazer group to actually develop the apprenticeship standard from scratch. The University of Cumbria also acts as the quality assurance support for the elements of education that we're trying to develop. And that's really important to make. For this to happen, for us to bring together the vocational and the academic, we need the collaboration between the employers, the university, and the organisation that's actually going to deliver the program. So, as an example of that, we actually call it a program of study rather than apprenticeship at Lakes. Now, this is an example of our nuclear engineering program. A lot of our employers, particularly in West Cumbria, like to have what's called a 3 and 2 model. And that is a hop-off approach. So rather than registering immediately onto a level 6 apprenticeship, they generally like to register them onto a level 5 first. So there are 2 apprenticeship standards in nuclear that we operate. One is the level 5 nuclear technician apprenticeship standard, and the second is the level 6 degree apprenticeship standard in nuclear scientist and nuclear engineer. We run them separately, and we integrate academic programs with each level of apprenticeship. So as you can see on the screen there is a variety of different pathways through this. So we have developed foundation degrees primarily mapped to the apprenticeship standard. So the program learning outcomes of the foundation degrees are mapped directly to the competencies, the skills, knowledge, and also the behavioral competencies into the program. So as we're delivering the foundation degree and as the students are studying on that program, they are naturally developing competence against the apprenticeship standard. It isn't something set aside where they're doing a qualification as a means of gaining a level 5 qualification. It is an integrated approach whereby working through that degree and the way those modules are structured, they are naturally generating evidence against the apprenticeship standard. And that's really, really important. It takes a lot of work to start with, but once you've got it set up, it works well. And that then answers a lot of the questions that Ofsted come up with. Why are they doing a foundation degree? Or should I say, why are they doing an apprenticeship standard? Why not just doing the foundation degree? And the question is it's an integrated approach. They can't do one without the other in reality. The two things work together, particularly if you get the starting point right. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll notice H&C and H&D. Now, this took a lot of work because we moved away from Pearson's H&Cs and H&Ds, and we wrote our own high nationals validated with the university. So we embedded into the high nationals the same work-based elements and work-based projects that you'll find in a foundation degree. And also what that also meant is that with the assessment approaches that the university use in terms of exams and percentage marks and so forth, it meant that we could also go with accreditation with the professional institutes, which was also successful. So by designing your own courses from the beginning and not using off-the-shelf qualifications, you can embed the competencies from the apprenticeship standard. That's really important. It's really difficult to try and get an off-the-shelf qualification to map to an apprenticeship standard. It really then starts to look like them and us, to be fair, if you take that approach. So the curriculum development for this integrated approach has to start at the beginning. On the completion of the level 5, and they complete an endpoint assessment, they can then progress into the level 6. Now, generally what we try and do is get the endpoint assessment done relatively early before the level 6 starts. Some employers like to leave it 12 months between level 5 and level 6 to give them plenty of time to do the endpoint assessment. But it is a hop-on, hop-off approach. So it gives the students a bit of time to potentially consolidate with their employer before starting their level 6. But it is there, and the progression pathway is there from level 5 to level 6. So level 6 that we deliver is an integrated apprenticeship. And that means that the integral to the endpoint assessment is actually the dissertation at the end of the degree, or in fact the second half of the degree, which is a 40 credit dissertation. And that forms part of the endpoint assessment, which is again externally assessed by chartered engineers from professional institutes, the endpoint assessment organization, and they recruit these external independent chartered engineers to support that process, and does require an honours degree within it, whereas the level 5 does not require a qualification. So what some universities have done is they've started delivering level 6 apprenticeship standards with existing honours degrees. Now, that's possible with some really close mapping and careful mapping, but it's not as easy as designing an honours degree from the beginning to ensure that the learning outcomes of the programs map directly into the competencies of the degree apprenticeship. And for me, that's best practice, is to do it from the beginning. If you are going to deliver a degree apprenticeship standard, then design and develop the degree from scratch to meet the requirements. It makes life so much easier in that sense. So, mapping to apprenticeship standards. Rather than open this document, I'll talk through it. Basically, two approaches. Well, the first thing to do is to map the program learning outcomes and design the program learning outcomes to meet the apprenticeship competencies wherever possible. Next, map the program learning outcomes against modules and module learning outcomes, individual learning outcomes. And then within the modules, identify the assessments, and then at a much more granular level, map the assessments to elements of competence and learning outcome. So it's a staged approach, a bit like a Russian doll, if you like. The granular level is at assessment level. Again, mapping to competence. Assessments within modules mapped to learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, and then course learning outcomes mapped to apprenticeship competencies. And it's an auditable trail from competence right through into assessment. And that's really important for the learners as well, because if they're working on a particular assessment, they're really keen to know how that's contributing towards their apprenticeship and contributing towards the development of a competence. And that works quite well. It takes a lot of work to start with, but once it's done, then it's done effectively. And any amendments to course program or assessment, when we're doing that, we have an internal approval process that ensures that the mapping is still occurring to apprenticeship competence. So how do we actually deliver this in terms of a delivery of the academic qualifications? Well, because it's vocational in nature, we have to have a variation in the formal delivery model of the academic qualification. So we use an experiential approach to teaching and learning. There's lots of learning from doing. And not only that, we try and use wherever possible industrial scale equipment and industrial standard software. So when they're actually undertaking practical assessments, they're taking practical assessments with equipment that they will see in the workplace. It's all part of the work readiness. An example of is when I was studying on a HNC many years ago. I was being taught PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and we're using a wooden box. Then when I suddenly appeared on plant and I opened up a control cabinet and I saw a PLC for the first time, a real one, I didn't recognize it at all. I thought, that's not a PLC. PLC is in a wooden box. So basically what we're trying to do is remove that mystery. So when they open that control cabinet, they are seeing something which they are familiar with. And that's the approach we take. So we're optimizing practical experimentation and investigation. And really important to this is we embed behavioral development throughout the program. So within our National College for Nuclear Northern Hub, as soon as they walk through that door, they are walking into a nuclear facility as far as we're concerned. And the behaviors that are expected within a nuclear facility have to be followed within our building. And therefore we have our building rules and so forth, very similar to the experience they'd have on plant. In addition to that, when they're actually working in the radiological environments in our building, we have the changing barrier procedures in place. And so right the way through that, they're experiencing behavioral development. Now, even based on full-time programs, when we're delivering full-time away from an apprenticeship, we are still embedding those behavioral developments. We're still developing that work readiness within. In addition, we utilize virtual reality suites wherever possible. So we have a good virtual reality systems, and we simulate industrial environments. So as you can probably imagine, access to a nuclear facility is difficult. And if we've got full-time students in particular who are not undertaking apprenticeships, then we have to, what we try and do with our work-based modules is give them an appreciation of what a plant would feel like and look like. So we utilize augmented reality and VR systems. Advantages. We develop a structured approach and supported path to registration with the Engineering Council. That's really important because as they're working through these apprenticeships, in reality, they're all, if we've got the mapping right, they're not just working towards the competencies within the apprenticeship, they're also working to the competencies within UK spec at the appropriate level. So it's a cross mapping between the UK spec and the competencies in the apprenticeship themselves. For us, they're one and the same thing in reality. Because if those apprenticeship standards have been developed correctly, then they should be mapping to the UK spec anyway. The degree or the higher education qualification has to be designed and developed by employers, and therefore that links into the Engineering Council requirements. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, big advantage is if this is done correctly and we get the starting points assessed properly, the employers can draw down funding through the apprenticeship levy, which is obviously very attractive. I thought I'd share this last couple of slides with you. And this has been very successful. We've developed an apprenticeship development coaching approach. Now, I mentioned earlier about the apprenticeship frameworks, the old apprenticeship frameworks, and that meant that providers had to have training assessors, and they were assessing in the workplace observations against NVQ qualifications. Now they've been removed. So therefore, there's no continuous assessment through the apprenticeship itself in terms of competencies. But in reality, there is no observations. There's very few these days observations in the workplace against competence. So therefore, how do we carry out progressive reviews? Well, we use an apprenticeship development approach, coaching approach. Now, an apprenticeship coach area, because if you're within the apprenticeship standard, all that technical development and support is been given by the teaching team, the expert teaching team. So what the coach is doing is acting as a link between the apprentice, the employer, and the academic delivery team. And the coach carries out, we generally carry out a 2-hour review with each apprentice every 3 months. Generally, it's about 8 weeks in reality. And what the apprenticeship coach is doing is talking to the line manager, employer, and the apprentice at each review and measuring their development. Measuring is the wrong word. Assessing is also the wrong word. But reviewing their progress against the competencies. And the coaching approach is pulling information out of the apprentice and out of the line manager about where they think their progress is towards those competencies. So they're not assessing. That's a key word. They're not assessing. They're coaching and reviewing against the competencies and pulling that information out of the apprentice and the line manager of where they think they are against those competencies. And that's really important because at the end of the day, the assessment is right at the end. It's not through the program, it's at the end. So what the coach is doing is basically coordinating that process, bringing the employer and the academic team and the apprentice together in determining their progress against competencies. Now that of course is supported by the college technical support tutors within the teaching teams, and also within the work-based modules that we deliver within the academic qualifications and work-based projects. All of that support is being provided by that team. The coach coordinates the relationship and the communication. And then, of course, the employer, it plays a key part in that. And we try to encourage the employer to nominate an apprentice coordinator within their organization to coordinate line managers and mentors. So this coordinated coaching approach has actually worked very well for ourselves and employers and the learners, which has meant we've had some very high success rates. So over the last 3 years, we've had 138 level 5 and level 6 successful endpoint assessments, with 100% level 5 first time pass rates and 93% level 6 first time pass rates. They are very high, and that is also down to the fact that our apprentices are of very high quality. They get a lot of good support from the employers. But I think the apprenticeship development coaching approach has really contributed towards those pass rates. And some of the other outcomes that have come from this. In fact, tomorrow, one of our level 6 graduates who's just completed a level 6 apprenticeship has just had their dissertation published, and she's presenting tomorrow at an international conference. So we're really proud of her, and that's an example of the outcome that can come from this, because what she's really done with that dissertation is she's really demonstrated how the knowledge she's gained in a degree has been integrated into her place of work, resulting in that. And of course, what else comes out of that is we get technicians, engineers who want to become members of the appropriate professional institutes, which is obviously really keen for all of us. You know, at the end of the day, the more chartered engineers, the more engineering technicians, the more incorporated engineers we can get out of this, the better. And it gives a lot of credibility to the overall apprenticeship scheme. So I think that's me at this stage.
Thanks, Paul.
Hopefully.